The caravanserai lay just beyond the city's western mud-brick walls, a vast, dusty courtyard of tamped earth surrounded by a single-story arcade of lodging rooms and stables. You arrived in the last hour of darkness, the air cool and carrying the scent of distant mountains, dung fires, and the pervasive fine dust of the Tarim Basin. The space was already a controlled chaos of low voices, grunting animals, and the creak of laden carts. You moved through the shadows, your role, that of a junior merchant's assistant, tasked with guarding a specific consignment, defined by the careful way you checked the knots on a line of Bactrian camels. Their double humps, soft with stored fat, were being packed with a fortune. There were the expected bales of raw silk from the east and crates of Celadon porcelain, but also rough sacks of pungent dried peppers, bricks of compressed tea, ingots of tin, and bundles of unpolished cotton jade. The wealth of continents was being lashed to wooden frames with thick hemp ropes that chafed against your palms. The caravan master, Anwar, stood by the main gate, a silhouette against the first gray hint of dawn. He was a Sogdian, his face a map of old sun and wind, and he spoke in a low, steady stream, giving final instructions to a cluster of men. His words were a practical liturgy. Check the water skins for leaks, balance the loads left and right, count the spare hobbles. The weight of the journey he described was not one of fear, but of sober, immense responsibility. It settled in your stomach like a stone. Around you, the caravan assembled itself. A Uyghur trader adjusted the felt saddle blankets on his string of smaller, quicker horses. A Persian merchant, in a robe of faded but fine wool, supervised the loading of rolled carpets with a critical eye. Two Mongol teamsters, their speech a series of sharp, guttural commands, efficiently secured bundles of fox pelts. A Chinese official, traveling light with only a single chest, stood apart, observing the proceedings with an inscrutable calm. This was the Silk Road's true currency. Not just goods, but people, a temporary society bound by shared direction and mutual need. The sky lightened to a pale gold over the jagged, snow-veined teeth of the Pamir Mountains to the west. Anwar raised a hand. The final ropes were tightened, the last personal bundles secured. A deep silence fell, broken only by the shifting of heavy hooves and the liquid sigh of a camel. Then with a nod, Anwar turned and walked through the gate. The caravan uncoiled itself to follow. There was no hurry, no dramatic departure. It was a slow, deliberate unfurling, a beast of burden and ambition awakening. You fell into step beside your assigned camel, its broad, padded feet whispering through the dust. The rhythm began immediately. The sway of its gait, the jingle of the brass bells on its harness, the smell of its warm, musky hide. You walked. The caravanserai shrank behind you, its sounds fading into the growing morning. The road ahead was not a clear line, but a worn path through a landscape of gravel and low, hardy scrub. The sun, now clearing the eastern hills, painted the world in long, sharp shadows, and a light that felt both new and ancient. The weight in your stomach began to shift, not lessening, but transforming from anxiety into a focused awareness of each step, each breath of thin, cool air. This was the beginning. The only task was to walk, to observe, to endure. The mountains waited and the desert beyond them. The caravan moved forward, a slow heartbeat against the vast, waking earth. The mountains did not so much end as surrender. Over 3 days, the rocky passes of the Pamirs gave way to sloping, barren foothills, which in turn flattened into a vast, stony plain. The air, once knife-sharp and cold, grew thick and heavy with a dry, baking heat that rose in visible shimmers from the ground by mid-morning. The world had been stripped of its verticality. Now there was only the immense, unbroken dome of the sky and the endless, horizontal expanse of the earth. This was the Gobi, the desert's stony fringe. The soil beneath your boots was not sand, but a pavement of rust-colored gravel and hard-packed, cracked earth that rang faintly with each footfall. Scraggle of tamarisk and camel thorn clung to life in the washes, their gray-green the only color besides the ubiquitous ochre and dun. The caravan's pace, deliberate in the mountains, became a metronomic plod, a slow consumption of distance measured in the regular, soft thuds of camel feet. Your assigned camel, a patient, dusty brown beast you had come to know by a chipped tooth on its left side, became your world. You walked at its shoulder, the heat of the day radiating through the soles of your boots, a dull burn that would settle into a deep ache by afternoon. The routine was simple, absolute. Your job was to walk, to ensure the load stayed balanced, to watch for any sign of lameness in the animal's gait. There was a profound intimacy in this silent partnership. You learned the rhythm of its breathing, the flick of its ear at a persistent fly, the way it would turn its head slightly, a dark, liquid eye regarding you with ancient indifference. On the morning of the 4th day out of Kashgar with the true desert, the sea of shifting dunes called the Taklamakan, the place of no return, a hazy line on the northern horizon, Anwar called a brief halt. He gathered the travelers not with a shout, but by simply stopping and turning, waiting for the line to coil in upon itself. "We enter the Gobi proper now," he said, his voice carrying easily in the thin, still air. He pointed southwest, his arm a stark line against the featureless landscape. "Our course is there, 5 days of walking to the next certain water." He let that sit for a moment, not as a threat, but as a fact as solid as the stones underfoot. It is not 5 days across the desert. It is 5 days between known points. The oasis of Yarkand lies there. We will not see it until we are upon it. Do not look for it. Look to your feet, to your animal, to your neighbor. He then demonstrated the evening and morning ritual. Each person was responsible for their own water skin, a swollen, blackened goat-hide bladder. You were to check the stitching around the neck for dampness, to feel the skin for unusual softness that might indicate a slow leak. You were to drink your allotted measure at the appointed times, not when thirst suggested, for thirst in this place was a liar that would lead to ruin. The water, when you sipped it, was already warm from the sun, tasting faintly of leather and minerals. The march resumed. The silence that descended was different from the quiet of the mountains. That had been a silence of awe, filled with the rush of wind over peaks. This was a contemplative, heavy silence, imposed by the landscape itself. The only sounds were the wind, a constant, low hiss as it scoured over gravel and stone, and the occasional creak of harness leather. Conversations died away, not from displeasure, but from a deep, shared understanding that words were precious moisture expended to little purpose. People retreated into themselves, into the private worlds of their own endurance. You walked. The sun climbed, a white, merciless coin in a sky bleached of all blue, fading to a pale, heated ivory. There were no clouds, no birds. The emptiness was total. It did not feel hostile, but profoundly indifferent, a scale against which a human life, a caravan, was less than a grain of that gravel. This induced not fear, but a strange, hollow calm. Your thoughts, which had buzzed with the details of departure, the memories of Kashgar's crowded lanes, slowly stilled. There was only the next step, the next breath, the slow, swaying bulk of the camel beside you. At midday, when the heat became a physical weight, Anwar led the caravan into the scant shade of a low limestone bluff. No one spoke. People attended to their animals, checking feet, adjusting loads. You pressed your back against the sun-warmed stone, feeling its residual heat through your tunic, and drank your measured sip of water. You looked out at the plain, shimmering in the heat haze, and understood the first true lesson of the journey. Progress here was not about speed, but about consistency. It was about the preservation of self and beast, a slow, stubborn persistence against a world that asked only for you to stop. The Taklamakan edge was not a boundary but a state of being. You had entered it fully. The only way was through, one measured step at a time, under the vast, empty, watching sky. The second day on the Gobi was a lesson in monotony, a deepening of the rhythms established the day before. The dawn was a silent, gray expansion, the stars fading into a uniform, pale wash. You rose from your thin bedroll stiffly, the cold of the desert night still lodged in your joints. The routine was automatic now, a careful sip of water, the methodical packing of your few belongings, the inspection of the camel's feet for stones, the retightening of ropes that had loosened in the dry air. There was no need for thought. The body remembered. The march began with the same slow unwinding. You took your place at the camel's shoulder, falling into step as it lurched to its feet with a soft groan. The sway of its gait, a rolling, oceanic motion you felt through the ground as much as saw, had become the world's pendulum. Time was no longer marked by the sun's position alone, but by the cycles of this motion. 100 swaying steps, then a slight adjustment of the cloth over your nose and mouth. Another 100, a glance at the horizon that never changed. Another 100, the taste of dust, fine as milled flour on your lips. Your face was swathed in a length of undyed cotton, dampened with a few precious drops of water at the last rest stop. It scratched against your skin, but it kept the dust from your lungs and the worst of the sun from your cheeks. You peered out through a narrow slit, your world reduced to a strip of gravel, the camel's trudging legs and the back of the traveler ahead. The heat built steadily, a pressure that seemed to flatten sound as well as spirit. You drank your allotted water at the exact time Anwar had prescribed. The warm, leathery liquid a scant relief, that did little more than acknowledge your thirst before denying it. At midday, Anwar guided the caravan to a halt in the lee of nothing at all, just a slightly flatter expanse of gravel where the wind had scoured the ground clean. There was no shade. The rest was a necessity for the animals, not a comfort for the people. You lowered yourself to the ground, the heat of the earth immediately seeping through your clothes. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft chewing of camels and the occasional clink of a water skin. You pulled a small cloth bundle from your pack, a piece of hard, unleavened flatbread and a handful of dried apricots, their surfaces dusty and sticky. As you began to eat, the paper maker from Samarkand settled nearby with a quiet sigh. You had noted him before, a man of middle years with delicate, stained fingers and a perpetually thoughtful expression. He ate with the same careful precision with which he did everything. After a long while he spoke, his voice a soft rasp as if unused. "The dust," he said, not looking at you but at the fine powder coating his bread. "It is a problem for my work. Even in a closed room in Samarkand it finds its way, settles on the pulp, makes a rough page." He took a small bite, chewed slowly. "But here it is everything. The air is paper before it is made." He fell silent again, and you thought the conversation had ended. Then he spoke once more, his eyes distant. "I use rags, linen, cotton, cleaned, beaten to fibers in the river. The water must be very clean. Then the sieve, the shaking, the pressing." He made a small, rocking motion with his hands, mimicking the action. "It is slow. It must be even. A page is a world. It must hold the ink without greed, without judgment." He glanced at you, a faint smile touching his eyes above the cloth masking his face. "You see, even here I think of it. The desert is a distraction. My mind goes back to the vat, to the feel of the wet sheet on the mold. It is quieter there." You nodded, offering him an apricot. He accepted with a slight bow of his head. There was no need for further words. His brief sharing was not an exchange of personal history, but a glimpse into the private sanctuary he carried within him, a craft that demanded purity in a world of dust. It was a form of endurance, mirroring your own. The rest period ended as quietly as it began. Anwar stood, and the caravan stirred back to life. The afternoon march was a mirror of the morning, the heat a solid wall you pushed against with each step. The monotony was not tedious. It had become a kind of meditation. The endless gravel, the unwavering sun, the rhythmic sway, they hollowed you out, scouring away the clutter of thought until only the essential remained. Movement, breath, persistence. As the sun began its descent, a transformation occurred. The harsh, white light softened to a deep, liquid gold. The long shadows of the camels stretched eastward, slender giants pacing silently across the plain. The sky, which had been a bleached void, now bled color at its edges. First a delicate rose, then a profound violet that deepened overhead into a velvet indigo. The gravel of the Gobi, so dull and unforgiving at noon, caught the dying light and glowed as if lit from within, each stone casting a tiny, elongated shadow. The world was painted in hues of gold and violet, the silence now filled with a majestic, serene beauty that felt like a reward for the day's endurance. You walked into this grandeur, the camel's bell making a soft, rhythmic chime that seemed part of the twilight. The cold began to return, a sharp contrast to the day's retained heat rising from the ground. You felt a deep, uncomplicated fatigue, and beneath it, a flicker of something new. Not yet acceptance, but a familiarity with the routine of hardship. The desert was no longer an imposing stranger. It was a condition to be met, day by day, step by step, under a sky that could be both merciless and unbearably beautiful. The caravan pressed on, a line of dark shapes against the fire of the west, moving toward the night and the next day's identical, necessary dawn. The green announced itself first as a smudge on the horizon, a blur of deeper color in the relentless ochre haze. For half a morning you doubted it, thinking it a trick of the heat's shimmer or a desperate mirage conjured by your own thirst. But the smudge grew, resolving into a dark line of poplar trees, their tall, straight forms a shocking geometry against the formless desert. Then came the scent, a faint, cool breath of damp earth and vegetation carried on. The wind, it was the smell of life, profound and simple. A low murmur, almost a sigh, passed through the caravan. Shoulders, hunched for days against the sun and dust, seemed to loosen. The oasis of Turpan did not so much appear as envelop. One moment you were on the gravel plain. The next, the path dipped into a depression, and you were walking between fields of vibrant green. Wheat and barley grew in orderly plots. Vineyards, their leaves a dusty emerald, sprawled over trellises. The air was suddenly, wonderfully thick with humidity and the hum of insects. The sound that dominated everything, however, was the water. Not the silent, hidden moisture of the Carez system yet, but the cheerful, rushing music of it flowing in open channels along the field edges, glittering in the sun. The caravan's pace did not quicken. Anwar maintained the same deliberate plod, guiding them to a familiar clearing on the outskirts of the main settlement, near the head of the irrigation works. The relief was not expressed in shouts or haste, but in the careful, almost reverent way the men tended to the camels. You helped lead your animal to one of the many stone channels. The water here was shockingly cold and clear, emerging from a low, arched opening in the earth, the mouth of a Carez. Anwar saw you looking. "From the mountains," he said, kneeling to splash his face. "Snowmelt from the Bogda Feng. The channels run underground for miles so the desert cannot drink it. Gravity does the work." The system was one of quiet genius. These were not the ornate fountains of a great city, but the pragmatic veins of a civilization that understood survival. You watched your camel drink, its great head lowered, water streaming from its lips. The animal drank for a long time, its sides swelling, and you felt your own parched body echo the sensation. The settlement itself was a cluster of sun-baked mud brick buildings, their flat roofs dotted with drying fruit. That evening, after the camels were watered and hobbled, you wandered into the small market square. The sensory shock was gentle but total. The air, once carrying only dust and heat, now held layers of scent. The smoky richness of lamb roasting on vertical spits, the honeyed perfume of ripe Hami melons stacked in pyramids, the dry, sweet smell of raisins and apricots drying on woven mats. After the monochrome of the desert, the colors felt almost loud, the crimson of peppers, the purple of eggplants, the vibrant dyes of cotton cloth hung for sale. The commerce here was of a different scale. This was not the high-stakes trading of Kashgar or the looming grandeur of Samarkand. It was the quiet, essential economy of an oasis. You observed a farmer, his hands stained with soil, trade a bolt of rough, homespun cotton to a desert herder for a worn but sturdy bag of rock salt. A woman exchanged a basket of fresh flatbreads for a small pottery jar of cumin. Words were few, the value was understood. Alongside goods, information flowed in low murmurs, news of a washed-out path to the north, the mood of a local khan, the price of fodder in the next valley. This trade was as vital as water. You purchased a slice of melon with a small copper coin. The flesh was cool, explosively sweet, and so juicy it ran down your chin. You ate it slowly, standing in the shade of a mulberry tree, feeling the juice as a minor miracle. The relief was profound, but it was tempered. This was a respite, not the destination. The mountains, the Tian Shan, formed a blue-white wall to the north, a reminder that the journey's true test was yet to come. That night, you slept on a flat rooftop, your bedroll laid out under a sky now familiar in its star-dusted expanse. The sounds of the desert were gone, replaced by the rustle of leaves in the night breeze, the distant bark of a dog, and faintly, the music of a deuter. Its two strings produced a plaintive, cyclical melody that seemed to speak of both sorrow and deep contentment, a sound woven from the very history of this green place in the barren land. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp soil and jasmine. Lying there, you felt the profound relief of shade and abundance seep into your bones. The constant, low-grade tension of the desert, the monitoring of water, the squinting against glare, dissipated. But as you listened to the deuter and watched the steady pulse of the stars, you understood that this comfort was a kind of preparation. The body was being allowed to remember ease, to store it up like the camels stored fat in their humps. Turpan was not an end. It was a filling of the cup before a longer, colder climb. The peace you felt was real, but it was the peace of a deep breath held before exertion. You slept, and for the first time in days, your dreams were not of dust, but of flowing water and the deep, sustaining green of leaves against a boundless sky. The green embrace of Turpan lasted only a morning. The caravan reassembled with a quiet efficiency, the camels. Humps plump from water and fodder, their loads rechecked and balanced for the ascent. The gratitude for the oasis was palpable, but it was a practical gratitude. No one lingered. The mountains to the north, the Tian Shan, the celestial mountains, were no longer a distant blue wall. They were the immediate future, a looming presence of rock and ice that demanded a different kind of endurance. The transition was swift. Within hours of leaving the irrigated fields, the air lost its humid weight. It grew thinner, sharper, carrying a new scent, the clean mineral smell of stone and faintly of snow. The path began to climb in earnest, not as a road, but as a slender, stony track etched into the mountainside by countless generations of hooves and feet. The world of horizontal plains vanished, replaced by a vertical realm of cliffs, scree slopes and distant, wind-carved ridges. You wrapped yourself in the extra layers pulled from your pack, a thick felt vest over your tunic, a woolen shawl wound around your neck and shoulders. The cold was not yet biting, but it was a persistent, probing presence that sought out every gap in your clothing. Your camel, sensing the change, placed its broad, two-toed feet with deliberate care, its soft pads finding purchase on the uneven rock. The sound of the climb was new. The crunch and clatter of dislodged stones, the sharper ring of iron-shod donkey hooves, the labored, steaming breath of the animals. The physical strain announced itself in your body with a blunt immediacy. The muscles in your calves and thighs, hardened by days of flat walking, now burned with a fresh, lactic ache with each upward step. Your lungs worked harder, drawing in the thin air in shallow, rapid pulls that never seemed quite sufficient. The rhythm of the desert was gone. Here, the rhythm was set by the terrain, a grueling climb up a switchback, a brief, cautious traverse across a slope of loose shale, then another climb. Progress was measured not in miles, but in the height of a rocky step conquered, the successful navigation of a narrow ledge. Yet, intertwined with the strain was a profound and humbling awe. You were walking into the sky. Looking back, the Turpan Depression was a smudge of distant green in a sea of brown, already seeming like a memory. Looking up, the world was a staggering geometry of stone. Snow-capped peaks, impossibly high and sharp, gleamed against a sky of a deeper, more intense blue than you had ever seen. Waterfalls born of melting glaciers traced silver threads down distant black cliffs, their sound a faint, constant whisper in the vast silence. The scale was incomprehensible, reducing the caravan to a line of insignificant insects crawling across the ribs of a giant. You walked at your camel's shoulder, one hand occasionally resting on its woolly flank for balance on the steeper sections. Its warmth was a comfort. Its patience was a lesson. It did not hurry or balk. It simply placed one foot, then the next, its head swaying low with the effort. You matched your breath to its slow, plodding tempo, finding a fragile harmony between your human strain and its animal endurance. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature began to plummet. The sun, still bright, lost its power to warm. The shadows in the deep valleys turned a cold, blue-black. Anwar, who had been scanning the route ahead, pointed to a high, flat pass between two wind-scoured peaks. "There," he said, his breath frosting in the air. "We camp there." The final climb to the pass was the hardest of the day. The air was so thin it felt like breathing through a cloth. Your heart thudded against your ribs. The path was a mere scratch across a steep face of broken rock. You focused entirely on the camel's hindquarters, on the placement of your own feet, on the next 3 feet of ground. There was no room for thought of the void that fell away to your left, only for the immediate physical fact of the ascent. Then, abruptly, the ground leveled. You had reached the pass. The world opened up in a breathtaking panorama. To the south, the desert stretched into a haze of infinity. To the north, range upon range of mountains rolled away, their peaks painted fiery orange and rose by the setting sun. The wind here was a constant, keening force, scouring the pass clean of all but the hardiest lichens, which clung to the rocks in orange and gray patches. The camp was made with a swift, wordless competence born of shared fatigue. There were no tents. Shelter was found behind windbreaks of piled stone, ancient and half-tumbled, built by those who had come this way before. The camels were hobbled in a tight group for warmth. A small, mean fire was coaxed from a bundle of precious dung and a few twigs of mountain thorn, its heat negligible but its light a psychological anchor against the deepening cold. You huddled in your felt and wool, your back against a cold rock, a bowl of hot barley gruel cupped in your stiff hands. The warmth of it was a tiny, concentrated sun in your core. Around you, men ate in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and the day's cold. The sky transformed from rose to violet to a profound, star-studded black. The cold intensified, a dry, penetrating cold that seeped through every layer and settled in the marrow of your bones. It was a cold that spoke of the high, lonely places of the earth, of ice ages and eternal winter. Lying in your bedroll, pressed between the camel and the stone windbreak for scant warmth, you looked up. The stars were not just above. They seemed to surround you, blazing with a cold, fierce intensity in the absolute clarity of the altitude. The wind moaned through the pass, a lonely sound that spoke of vast distances and timeless solitude. The ache in your muscles was a dull, constant hum. Yet within the hardship there was a strange, exultant clarity. You had climbed into the roof of the world. The desert's thirst, the oasis's comfort, both were far below. Here, there was only the elemental struggle against rock, height, and cold, and the stunning, silent beauty that was its reward. You shivered, pulling the wool over your face, and waited for dawn, knowing the descent would bring its own trials. But for now, there was only the high, cold dark and the immense, quiet majesty of the mountains holding you in their frozen palm. The dawn was a gray seep into a world of black and silver. Frost feathered every surface, the wool of your blanket, the leather of the packs, the coarse hair on the camels' humps. Movement was a painful, creaking necessity. You rose with the others, limbs stiff, breath pluming in thick clouds. There was no water to spare for washing. You rubbed a handful of gritty snow over your face, the shock of it sharpening your senses into raw focus. The caravan assembled with a quiet, purposeful haste. The task now was descent. If the ascent had been a trial of stamina, the descent was a test of nerve and meticulous care. The path down the northern slope was treacherously different. It was a loose, sliding surface of scree, fragments of shattered rock that shifted and skittered underfoot with every step. The camels, so sure-footed on the climb, now moved with extreme caution, their legs splayed slightly, their great weight balanced with delicate precision. You no longer walked at your animal's shoulder. You walked ahead, picking a tentative route, testing each foothold before committing your weight. The world narrowed to the patch of ground directly before your boots. Total focus was not a choice. It was the only way to avoid a twisted ankle or a disastrous fall. The meditative monotony of the desert was gone, replaced by a sustained, quiet tension that hummed in your nerves. This tension crystallized halfway down the morning's trek. The path, tracing a cliff face, was partially buried under a fresh, sloping spill of rock and dirt, a recent landslide. It was not a dramatic chasm, but a deceptive, unstable slope of rubble that vanished over the edge into a mist-filled gorge below. The caravan halted. Anwar moved forward alone, probing the slide with a long staff, watching how the stones reacted. He returned, his expression unchanged. "Slowly," he said, his voice low. "One at a time, lead your animals. No sudden moves." There was no discussion, no panic. The cooperative mechanics of the caravan engaged as silently as a well-oiled machine. The first man, a Mongol teamster, led his string of 3 horses across. He moved with the light, balanced steps of a dancer, his eyes fixed on the path his feet would take, not on the drop. The horses, sensing his calm, followed, their hooves dislodging small cascades of pebbles that rattled into the void. Once across, he turned and stood, a living anchor point. Then it was your turn. You took a deep breath, the cold air biting your lungs, and stepped onto the slide. The rubble shifted under your boot with a sickening, granular sigh. You focused on the teamster's face across the gap, a point of stillness. You did not think of the gorge. You thought of the next step, the placement of your foot on a slightly larger, embedded stone. Your camel, sensing your tension through the lead rope, hesitated. You made a soft, clicking sound with your tongue, a noise of reassurance you had learned from Anwar, and pulled gently, steadily. The animal followed, its great weight causing a deeper, more profound settling of the rubble. The sound of skittering stones was loud in the absolute silence. Time stretched. Then you were on the solid path beyond, your heart thudding against your ribs. You turned, as the teamster had, and watched the next person make the crossing. It took over an hour for the entire caravan to negotiate the 50-yard span. It was a silent ballet of mutual dependence, a wordless understanding that a single misstep could doom more than just the individual. When the last camel was across, there was no celebration, only a collective, unspoken exhalation. The march resumed, the focus, if possible, intensifying. By late afternoon, the character of the mountains began to soften. The air grew thicker, easier to breathe. Scree gave way to stable soil, and the first stunted, wind-bent pines appeared, then meadows of tough, green grass. It was into one such high meadow that the herder appeared. He was a Kirghiz, mounted on a small, shaggy horse that seemed part of the landscape. He wore a thick coat of felt and sheepskin, and a tall, white felt hat. He watched the caravans approach with an expression of neutral assessment, not curiosity. He was perhaps 40, his face weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, his eyes a calm, dark brown. 100 yards away, a single yurt, its felt covering the color of cream, stood like a solitary mushroom against the green, a thin wisp of smoke rising from its crown. Anwar raised a hand in greeting. The herder nudged his horse forward. They spoke briefly, an exchange of guttural syllables and gestures. It was not a social call, but a practical intersection of 2 nomadic worlds, one of trade routes, the other of seasonal pastures. The herder had cheese, hard and salty, and information about the conditions on the trails ahead. You felt a sudden, impulsive need for a transaction, a tangible connection to this different life. From your small personal bundle, you retrieved a plain ceramic bowl you had carried from Kashgar, a simple, sturdy thing, glazed a deep brown. You approached the herder and held it out. He took it, turned it over in his rough hands, tapped it with a fingernail. He nodded, then reached into a saddlebag and produced a wedge of cheese, pale yellow and veined with blue mold, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He handed it to you. The trade was complete without a single shared word. That evening, the caravan made camp near the herder's meadow, the first camp in days with ample grass and a small, clear stream. As a gesture of thanks for the information, Anwar offered the herder a measure of tea bricks. The herder, in turn, joined the edge of the campfire's circle. He spoke through one of the Mongol teamsters who understood some of his tongue. His stories were not epics but practical observations. The winter had been mild, meaning the snowmelt was strong and the passes were clear earlier than usual. A pack of wolves had taken 2 of his sheep. The best route to avoid the next landslide area was to follow the western fork of the stream for a full day. He spoke of the mountains not with poetry, but with the intimate, unromantic knowledge of a man who read the weather in the ache of an old injury and the behavior of his horses. His life, you understood, was one of different hardships, a cyclical grind of isolation, and weather just as demanding as the caravan's linear journey. There was no romance, only resilience. The next morning the herder was gone, his yurt dismantled, leaving only a circle of flattened grass. The caravan moved on, dropping steadily now into greener, broader valleys. The air lost its knife-edge cold. Pine forests thickened, and the sound of running water was a constant companion. The tension of the descent eased from your shoulders. You walked, the taste of the sharp, crumbly cheese still a memory on your tongue, a solid, earthy contrast to the abstract awe of the peaks. You had crossed the spine of the world. The landscape ahead was opening, promising not an end but a change. The mountains had been a trial of elements. What lay beyond, you sensed, would be a trial of civilization. The caravan pressed on, leaving the realm of stone and sky for the world of men, its pace still deliberate, its collective heartbeat steady against the vast, receding silence of the heights. The first sight of Samarkand was not of walls or gates, but of a shimmer in the air, a haze of dust and smoke and human industry that hung above the Zarafshan River Valley like a promise. Then, as the caravan crested a final, gentle rise, the city revealed itself. It did not emerge gradually. It struck the eye with the force of a revelation. There, rising from the plain in a blaze of turquoise and lapis lazuli, were the domes. They swelled against the sky, immense and serene, their ceramic skins catching the afternoon sun and fracturing it into a million shards of brilliant, impossible blue. The Registan Square was the heart of this vision. You entered through a city gate thronged with traffic, donkey carts, soldiers on horseback, pilgrims on foot, and were funneled directly into its vast, open space. Your breath caught not from exertion but from sheer scale. 3 monumental madrasas framed the square, their facades a breathtaking tapestry of glazed tile. Geometric patterns in deep blue, white, and gold spiraled around arched portals tall enough to admit a giant. The tilework was not merely decoration. It was a form of architecture in itself, a skin of frozen, luminous geometry that seemed to vibrate with a silent, celestial mathematics. The square was not empty, but its human activity, scholars hurrying between doorways, water sellers resting in patches of shade, was dwarfed into insignificance by the overwhelming grandeur of the structures. This was not a city built for people. It was a city built for empire, for God, and for the awe of travelers like you. The caravan's arrival was absorbed without ceremony. Anwar led them to a familiar caravanserai on the square's periphery, a cavernous, soot-blackened structure whose own grandeur was purely functional. The sense of relief was palpable, but it was a different relief from that of Turpan. This was not the solace of water and shade, but the satisfaction of reaching a legendary coordinate, a name on the map made gloriously, overwhelmingly real. The following day was a rest day, a deliberate pause to let men and beasts recover and to allow the merchants to conduct their business. You followed Anwar not as a participant, but as a shadow, an observer drawn into the city's commercial bloodstream. He led the way to the covered bazaar, a labyrinth of vaulted lanes branching off from the registan. The sensory assault was immediate and total, a cacophony that contrasted violently with the square's silent majesty. Sound layered upon sound. The high, rhythmic hammering of coppersmiths shaping ewers and trays created a metallic heartbeat. From dark stalls, scribes called out their services, their voices a learned counterpoint to the raw shouts of butchers and vegetable sellers. The air was thick with smells, the tang of dye vats, the sweetness of stacked melons and raisins, the pungency of spices, cumin, coriander, saffron, and the dry, ancient scent of dust stirred by 1,000 feet. Most pervasive was the sound of commerce itself. The rapid fire haggling over bolts of silk unfurled to show their shimmering patterns, the clink of coins on brass scales, the murmured negotiations in a dozen tongues. You watched as Anwar, his demeanor shifting from caravan master to seasoned merchant, approached a specific stall deep in the bazaar's heart. It was a niche specializing in stones. Rough chunks of malachite, polished carnelian beads, and most prominently, raw lumps of lapis lazuli from the mountains of Badakhshan. The stone was a deep, celestial blue veined with flecks of golden pyrite, like a piece of the night sky captured in mineral. The negotiation that followed was a quiet, formal ritual. A dalal, a broker with a carefully trimmed beard and a robe of subdued wool, stood between Anwar and the lapidary who owned the stock. The dalal did not raise his voice. He listened as Anwar stated his interest, then turned to the lapidary and conveyed the inquiry. The lapidary, a man with eyes permanently narrowed from squinting at flaws, hefted a particularly fine piece, turning it in the light filtering through a high window. He spoke a price to the dalal, who relayed it to Anwar with a neutral tone. Anwar did not react to the number. He instead asked a question about the stone's origin, which specific mine. The dalal translated. The lapidary's answer was detailed, a pedigree of the stone. This established seriousness. Anwar then made a counteroffer, not on price at first, but on quantity. If he took 3 pieces of similar quality, what then? The dalal conveyed this, his hands making small, precise gestures. The lapidary considered, then named a new aggregate price. It was still high. Only then did Anwar gently touch the stone in question, running a thumb over its cool, polished surface. He mentioned, casually, a slight cloudiness in one corner, a common flaw that would reduce its value when cut for pigment or inlay. It was not an accusation, but an observation of fact. The square heading for the western gates and the road to Bukhara. Samarkand was magnificent, but it was not restful. Its beauty was demanding, its scale humbling, its commerce relentless. That evening, back in the caravanserai, the sounds of the city were a distant rumble through thick walls. You lay on your bedroll. The image of the Registan's tilework burned into your mind's eye. The journey's fatigue had been masked by the day's stimulation, but it returned now, a deep, familiar companion. Samarkand had been a spectacle, a crescendo in the journey's middle passage. But as you listened to the snores of the men around you and the occasional stamp of a camel from the courtyard below, you knew it was not your destination. It was a way station, however glorious. The road called, its rhythm now ingrained in your bones, a slower, steadier beat than the frantic pulse of the city. You closed your eyes, the memory of Lappy's lazuli blue fading into the welcome darkness, and prepared to walk again. The grandeur of Samarkand faded with each westward step, not into barrenness, but into a gentler, cultivated world. The caravan followed the life-giving thread of the Zarafshan River, its waters a shimmering companion to their left. The landscape was a tapestry of human care. Fields of young wheat and barley, their green a tender contrast to the remembered ochre of the desert. Orderly rows of mulberry trees, their leaves destined for silkworms. And pastures where flocks of fat-tailed sheep grazed under the watch of boys with slings. The air smelled of damp soil, blooming clover, and the distant, sweet smoke of charcoal kilns. After the monumental scale of Samarkand and the elemental trials of the mountains, this week-long journey to Bukhara felt like an exhalation. The pace remained steady, but the mood was lighter, the silence among the travelers more companionable than contemplative. The rhythm of travel transformed. The desperate focus on preservation was gone. Now the days held a steady, almost leisurely cadence. You walked at your camel's shoulder, the animal's steps softer on the packed earth of the tow paths and country tracks. The sun was warm, but a breeze from the river kept the heat kind. Your duties shifted from survival to maintenance. You watched for stones in the camel's path not out of fear for its survival, but to prevent a limp that could slow the caravan. You checked the load ropes for wear, not because a lost bale meant catastrophe, but because it was poor practice to arrive in Bukhara with goods askew. The evenings were the heart of this new chapter. Camp was made in meadows near the riverbank, where the camels could graze on the thick grass and drink their fill. The fires, built from abundant deadfall, were larger, their light a warm pool in the vast, velvet night. The time after the meal was no longer for immediate, exhausted sleep, but for the small, sustaining acts of community and upkeep. You sat cross-legged by the fire, a needle of polished bone and a length of sinew thread in your hands, carefully repairing a split seam on a grain sack. The task was simple, meditative. Nearby, the paper-maker from Samarkand examined the soft pad of his camel's left forefoot, probing gently with his stained fingers. He found a small, embedded pebble and removed it with a pair of iron tweezers from his kit, then applied a paste of rendered fat and antiseptic herbs from a clay pot, wrapping the foot in a clean strip of linen. His movements were as precise and unhurried as they were in his workshop. Others honed knife blades on whetstones, conditioned leather harnesses with oil, or sorted through their personal bundles, discarding a worn-out shirt, repacking a precious keepsake. It was during these hours of shared, quiet industry that the tales began. They were not told to entertain, but to pass the time, to weave the fabric of shared experience. Anwar stirring a pot of tea with a stick might speak without preamble. 10 years ago on the Dashti Caviar, a wind came up at dusk, he said, his voice a low rumble. Not a storm, a simoom. It stole the breath from your lungs. The sand was like needles. We turned the camels into it, made them kneel and lay against their sides. For 2 hours, you heard nothing but the scream of the wind and the hiss of sand burying everything. When it passed, the stars were the same, but the path was gone. We found it again at dawn by the shadow of a single rock that had not moved. A Mongol teamster, carving a new toggle for a saddle, grunted in recognition. Snow in the Altai, he said, his words translated by a companion. White sky, white ground, no difference. The lead horse walked off a ledge we could not see. We lost the horse, 2 sacks of salt. We tied ropes man to man, and followed the sound of a river we could not see until we found a cliff to shelter under, cold like teeth. The stories were always like this, brief, unadorned accounts of disaster survived through procedure, patience, and a grim cooperation. A route lost to flooding, a spring found dry, necessitating a brutal 2-day detour, a fever that swept through a caravan, leaving the healthy to tend the sick and drive the animals. There was no boasting in the telling. The events were related as one might describe checking a water skin or balancing a load, as facts of the road, hazards managed and endured. Listening, you understood these tales were a kind of map, not of geography, but of peril. They were lessons passed in the firelight, reinforcing the unspoken codes that kept the caravan alive. One evening the papermaker spoke, not of the road but of his city. In Samarkand in the spring, the wind from the desert sometimes carries a red dust, he said, holding his hands to the fire. It settles on the drying paper. You must brush each sheet with a feather before the sizing sets, or the page is forever flawed. It is a week of extra work every year. He smiled faintly. Here the dust is just dust. It is a relief. You shared little yourself, but you felt included in the circle. Your presence, your attentive silence, your own small repairs were contribution enough. The camaraderie was not one of boisterous friendship, but of mutual recognition. You were all people who had chosen or been compelled by circumstance to submit to the road's demands. The shared routine, the pre-dawn packing, the midday rest, the evening maintenance, forged a bond deeper than conversation. It was a bond of synchronized movement and shared fatigue. And then there were the nights, when the maintenance was done and the tales had faded into silence. You would lie back on your bedroll, the fire reduced to embers. The world opened up above you, freed from the light pollution of cities and the dust haze of the desert. The stars here in the river valley were a breathtaking, crowded magnificence. The Milky Way was a spilled river of diamond dust across the black velvet of the sky. Constellations you knew were drowned in 1,000 unfamiliar points of light. The immensity was not intimidating. as it had been on the Gobi. It felt peaceful, a vast and silent witness to your small, fire-lit circle. Lying there, the murmur of the Zarafshan a constant whisper nearby, you felt the journey settle into your bones in a new way. The anxiety of the beginning, the focused endurance of the desert and mountains, had matured into a calm proficiency. You knew your place in the caravan's organism. You understood its rhythms and its needs. The road to Bukhara was not a challenge to be overcome, but a space to be inhabited, a week of steady progress through a benevolent land, a time of healing for the animals and consolidation for the people. The peace was not an absence of effort, but the peace of effort applied correctly, in company, under a sky that made the world feel both immense and intimately, profoundly calm. The caravan was a self-contained world, moving steadily forward, its collective heartbeat slow and sure, carrying its stories and its mended sacks towards the ancient, shadowed lanes of the next city. The approach to Bukhara was a study in subtlety. Where Samarkand had announced itself with a blaze of turquoise against the sky, Bukhara revealed itself as a low, dun-colored smudge rising from the irrigated plain, its outline punctuated not by soaring domes but by the stark, tapering cylinder of the Kalyan minaret, the Tower of Death. As the caravan passed through the city gates, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The overwhelming, imperial grandeur of the Registan was replaced by a sense of dense, ancient gravity. The streets here were not broad avenues but narrow, winding lanes, shaded by the sheer, windowless walls of mud brick houses and vaulted bazaars. The air, still and cool in the shadows, carried the scent of old dust, dry clay, and something else, a faint, alkaline smell you would later recognize as paper. Anwar led the caravan to a caravanserai deep in the city's heart, a place of echoing courtyards and deep, cool stalls. The business of Samarkand, the high-stakes trading of gems and silk, was done. Here the mood was quieter, the commerce more specialized. After the camels were seen to, you were left to your own devices. The instruction was implicit: rest, resupply, but also observe. Bukhara was a city of craft and contemplation, the scholarly counterpart to Samarkand's mercantile roar. You wandered without a fixed destination, drawn into the labyrinth. The silence was profound, broken only by the scuff of your own boots on worn stone and the distant, rhythmic tapping from behind closed doors. The Kalyan minaret loomed ahead, a silent sentinel. You turned down a lane that ran along its base, the way so narrow you could touch both walls with outstretched arms. The shade was a tangible relief, a coolness that held the memory of night. A low, open doorway exhaled a damp, vegetal smell into the lane. Peering inside, you saw a sun-drenched courtyard. Two men stood waist-deep in a stone vat, stirring a thick, gray slurry with long wooden paddles. This was a paper workshop. You stepped inside, the transition from shadow to bright courtyard light momentarily blinding. The master paper maker, an elderly man with forearms corded with muscle and stained a pale gray, nodded permission as he lifted a rectangular wooden frame, a mold, from a trough of milky water. On its fine mesh screen rested a perfect, trembling sheet of nascent paper. With a practiced, rocking motion, He transferred the sheet onto a felt blanket, adding it to a tall stack. The process was hypnotic in its simplicity and slowness. "From rags," the man said, noticing your gaze. His voice was as dry as the dust outside. "Linen, cotton, beaten, then boiled. The water must be clean. The desert tries to ruin it with dust, but here the walls help." He gestured to the high courtyard walls that kept out the wind. His explanation was not for a customer, but for someone who appreciated process. It was a quieter echo of the paper maker on the caravan, a testament to a craft that demanded purity and patience. You watched for a long time, the only sounds the splash of water and the steady, rocking transfer of sheet onto felt, each one a potential world for words. Further on, in a smaller courtyard festooned with dripping hanks of yarn, you found the dye maker. His domain was a symphony of color in pots. Indigo fermented in a deep vat, its surface a metallic, iridescent blue. Madder root simmered in another, yielding a deep, earthy red. A mortar held the precious, crimson flakes of crushed cochineal. The dyer, a young man with permanently stained hands the color of a sunset, was carefully lowering a skein of white wool into a saffron-yellow bath. The smell here was sharp, chemical, and sweet all at once, the scent of transformation. He worked in silence, his focus absolute, pulling color from the earth and fixing it onto fiber, a quiet alchemist in his shaded court. But it was the scriptorium that held you. You found it by following the scent of ink and old paper, a dry, scholarly smell that led to a second-story room above a bookseller's stall. Light fell in thick, dusty shafts from high, grilled windows onto a scene of intense, silent concentration. 6 copyists sat on low cushions at angled desks, their heads bowed. The only sounds were the scratch of reed pens on paper, the occasional soft clink of an inkstone, and the gentle turn of a page. They were not all copying Qurans. One worked on a medical treatise, its margins filled with intricate diagrams of herbs. Another transcribed a volume of poetry, the elegant Naskh script flowing like a dark river across the page. A third, his eyes magnified by a large lens, repaired the frayed binding of an ancient astronomical text. The head scribe, a man with a wispy white beard and ink-stained fingertips, looked up as you hovered in the doorway. His eyes were tired but keen. He did not speak, but gestured to a small table near the entrance where finished goods were displayed. Reed pens, cakes of solid ink, and a few small, hand-bound notebooks. They were simple things, their covers undyed leather, their pages the same soft, sturdy paper you had seen being borne in the courtyard workshop. You picked one up. It was faintly rough to the touch, the fibers visible in the sheet. It felt substantial in your hand, a repository of potential. Without a word, you placed a few small coins on the table. The scribe nodded, his attention already returning to the precise world of his desk. You slipped the notebook into the inner fold of your tunic, feeling its solid, quiet weight against your chest. Leaving the scriptorium, you descended back into the shadowed lane. The sensory details of the day coalesced. The cool, mineral smell of wet paper pulp, the pungent breath of the dye vats, the dry, solemn scent of ink and aged paper, and the perpetual, cool shade of the thick brick walls that held the city's scholarly silence within them. It was a reflective contrast to the open road, to the sun-blasted deserts and wind-scoured passes. Here, the Silk Road's movement was not of bodies and bales, but of ideas, fixed patiently onto pages that would outlast the caravans that might carry them. That evening, back in the caravanserai, you took out the notebook. In the fading light, you ran a thumb over its blank pages. It was not a ledger for accounts, nor a journal for profound thoughts. It was an object, a piece of Bukhara's quiet craft. It represented the other half of the journey's heart, not the arduous crossing of space, but the careful preservation of thought across time. The caravan would move on, but this city, in its shaded lanes, specialized in stillness and permanence. You put the notebook away, the memory of the scratching pens and the rocking paper mold lingering like a calm, steady counterpoint to the rhythm of your own footsteps, which would soon resume carrying. That quiet with you onto the final, stony stretch towards Merv. The road east from Bukhara was a farewell to rivers and shade. For a day, the caravan followed the last, dwindling irrigation channels, the fields growing sparser, the soil more granular. Then the channels ended, and the earth rose in a gentle, relentless swell. They were ascending the Kara-Kum Plateau, a stony tableland that stretched to the horizon in a monochrome of bleached umber and gray. The final major leg had begun. The landscape was austere, stripped of all superfluity. There were no trees, only occasional skeletal bushes of saxaul, their gnarled roots clutching the gravel like fists. The ground was a uniform pavement of fist-sized stones and flinty shards, all smoothed and sorted by millennia of wind. The sky, a pale, high dome, seemed to press down, amplifying the emptiness. Yet in its simplicity there was a severe, clean beauty. The lines were clear, the colors pure, ochre, slate, the white of sun-bleached limestone. It was a landscape that demanded nothing and offered nothing but itself. Fatigue was no longer an episodic visitor. It was a constant companion, a deep, settled weariness in the bones. It was not the sharp, lactic burn of the mountain ascent, nor the parched exhaustion of the desert. This was a systemic fatigue, the accumulated debt of months and miles. Your muscles moved with the dull, automatic obedience of overused machinery. Your feet, inside your worn boots, felt both swollen and weightless, as if they belonged to someone else. The journey's rhythm was so deeply ingrained that you walked, ate, and slept within it, a ghost of habit animating your form. Your reflections, once occupied with the novelty of each new vista or the mechanics of survival, turned inward. The notebook from Bukhara, a quiet weight against your chest, seemed to pulse with the unasked question, for what? You had crossed deserts that stole breath, mountains that scraped the sky, cities that dazzled the eye. You had guarded silk you would never wear and porcelain you would never use. The purpose, once so clear in the ambition of departure, to reach Merv, to complete the contract, to see the legendary road, now felt distant, abstract. The purpose had been swallowed by the process. The journey had become its own reason. The enduring, the witnessing, the simple, monumental fact of continued forward motion. In this state of deep weariness and introspection, the small, personal rituals of the day took on a sacred, sustaining weight. They were tiny islands of agency in the vast sea of fatigue. Each morning, in the cold, gray light before dawn, you performed the ritual of the bedroll. It was not a hasty bundling. First, you would sit on it for a long moment, feeling the residual warmth of your body seep away into the stony ground. Then, with stiff fingers, you would brush away every visible pebble and speck of dust, a futile gesture against the omnipresent grit, but a necessary one. You would fold the worn wool blanket with a precision that bordered on ceremony, tucking the edges in just so, before rolling the entire assembly tight and securing it with its leather strap. The act was meditative. It was the first assertion of order in the new day, a reclaiming of a small, personal space from the formless plateau. The packing of your meager kit was another ritual. The water skin, its leather now supple and dark from use, was always placed on the right side of the pack, its stopper checked twice. The small bag of personal effects, a spare tunic, the fire-starting flint, a wooden comb, went to the left. The notebook, wrapped in an extra piece of felt, rested in the center, protected. Each item had its ordained place, a geography you could navigate by touch in the dark. This order was a defense against the entropy of the road, a way to impose a narrative of control on the day's inevitable attrition. The most potent ritual was reserved for the hour before the midday halt, when the sun was at its most oppressive, and the plateau seemed to vibrate with heat. From a secret pocket sewn into your belt, you would retrieve your private stash. 3 dried dates, hard as wood and coated in a sugary bloom, saved from the markets of Turpan. You never ate them all at once. You would select one, feeling its wrinkled, sticky surface. You would hold it in your palm for several paces, a secret wait. Then, with deliberate slowness, you would bring it to your mouth. The act of eating it was protracted. First, you would soften it between your teeth, letting the leathery skin give way. Then the taste would bloom, a deep, caramel sweetness, a concentrated memory of sun and palm trees and abundant water. You would let the paste of it coat your dry mouth, swallowing in tiny increments, making the single date last for 100 steps. It was not about nourishment. It was about a private, sensory memory of a kinder place. It was a moment of pure, selfish pleasure, a tiny rebellion against the austerity of the plateau and the communal discipline of the caravan. In that taste, you were not a weary traveler on a stone wasteland. You were briefly, gloriously, a person enjoying a piece of fruit in the shade. By the time the pit was clean, the ritual complete, the next rest stop would be in sight, the small pleasure having bridged the gap of the hardest hours. You walked. The plateau stretched on, featureless but for the occasional dry wash cutting across the path. The caravan was a line of silent, dust-caked shapes. Conversations had long since died away, not from strife, but from a shared, unspoken understanding that words were an unnecessary expenditure of energy. The camaraderie was present, but it was expressed in actions. The slight shift to windward to shield a neighbor from a gust of grit, the silent offering of a water skin to someone whose own looked perilously slack, the shared glance when a familiar, crooked rock, a rare landmark, came into view. The papermaker walked ahead of you, his steps as measured as ever. You saw him, at the midday halt, take a small, flat stone from his pack and a stub of charcoal. On the stone's surface, he made a few swift, sure lines, the suggestion of a mountain peak, the curve of a camel's neck. Then, with a sigh, he wiped it clean with his thumb, erasing the image back into dust. It was his ritual, a creation and dissolution as transient as the journey itself. As the sun began its descent, painting the stone fields in long, lavender shadows, the deep fatigue in your bones felt almost comfortable. It was the fatigue of a task nearly done, a weight that had become part of your structure. The inward gaze, the personal rituals, the silent companionship, these were the final lessons of the road. The purpose of the journey, you began to sense, was not waiting in Merv. It was here, in the weary, steady plod across the stones, in the taste of a saved date, in the meticulous folding of a blanket. It was in the understanding that you had been reduced to your essentials, and you had endured. The plateau, in its stark beauty and demanding emptiness, was the anvil upon which the journey's meaning was being finally forged. You walked on, the notebook a quiet promise against your chest, the rhythm of your steps the only prayer you needed, under the vast, silent and watchful sky. The green announced itself not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual persuasion. For a full morning, the eye, trained on the monochrome of the plateau, dismissed it as another trick of the heat haze, a smudge of wishful thinking on the southern horizon. But the smudge persisted. It deepened from a blur into a band, a distinct line of darker texture against the bleached umber of the stone. Then, carried on a faint shift of wind from the south, came the scent. It was the smell of damp soil, of green things growing, of water not hidden in skins but coursing freely through roots and leaves. It was the smell of the oasis of Merv. There was no rush in the caravan, no quickening of pace or outburst of relief. The reaction was a collective, almost imperceptible softening. Shoulders, held tight against the plateau's emptiness for days, lowered a fraction. The rhythm of the walk, that deep, ingrained metronome, did not change. If anything, it became more deliberate, as if savoring its own final measures. The journey's end was in sight, but the habit of travel was too strong to break abruptly. You simply walked towards the green, the camel's steady sway beside you now feeling like the final, gentle rocking of a cradle. Life returned in increments. First, a single, dusty brown desert lark burst from behind a saxaul bush, its flight a frantic scribble against the sky. Then another. Then the low, persistent hum of insects, bees, flies, a sound so long absent it felt like a memory made real. The hard-packed earth underfoot began to show traces of finer, darker soil. Scattered, hardy grasses appeared, then thicker clumps. The air lost its desiccated edge, gaining a palpable weight of moisture. The world was slowly re-inhabiting itself, and you were walking into the heart of that reclamation. The final miles were traversed in a state of quiet, profound acceptance. The anxiety of departure, the focused endurance of the trials, the contemplative fatigue of the plateau, all of it had burned away, leaving a calm, hollowed-out clarity. The journey's rhythms were no longer something you followed. They were the substance of your being. Your feet moved of their own accord. Your breath matched the camel's plod. Your hands, resting on the pack rope, felt the familiar texture of the hemp without needing to see it. You were a component of the caravan, and the caravan was a single organism reaching its destination. There was no need for thought. There was only the walking, the growing scent of soil and irrigation water, and the expanding green line ahead resolving into individual trees, tall, graceful poplars and broad cannade. Mulberries. The outskirts of Merv were not a walled city like Samarkand or a dense labyrinth like Bukhara. It was a sprawling, cosmopolitan hub, its influence radiating from a core of ancient citadels and newer settlements along the Murghab River. The caravan approached one of the many large caravanserais that clustered on its northern edges. This one was a fortress of trade, its high, mud-brick walls enclosing a vast courtyard already bustling with activity. The sounds were a muted version of Samarkand's bazaar, the calls of grooms and porters, the braying of donkeys, the lowing of oxen being loaded for journeys west. The scale was immense, but the mood was purposeful, not overwhelming. The arrival was understated. Anwar guided them through the great arched gate, his eyes scanning for a familiar factor, the man who managed this sarai. A nod was exchanged across the crowded yard. Without a word, the caravan coiled into an assigned space along one of the long arcades. The journey was over. The unloading began immediately, a reverse of the ritual in Kashgar. Your hands moved automatically, fingers finding the knots they had tied months and a continent ago. The ropes, bleached and frayed, came loose. The bales of silk, lighter now, were handed down. The crates of porcelain were lowered with care onto waiting carts. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. The work was the acknowledgement. Each unloaded item was a mile accounted for, a danger passed, a contract fulfilled. You worked in silence with the others, the physical labor a final, shared act. The camel, freed of its burden, shook itself with a great, rattling shudder, then knelt with a soft groan, its long journey done. By the time the last bundle was transferred, the sun was a swollen, orange globe sinking towards the western rim of the plateau. The courtyard's shadowed corners deepened to purple. You found a section of low wall at the edge of the sarai, its mud brick surface still warm from the day's sun, and sat. From here, you could see the life of Merv flowing around the caravanserai's island of arrival. Long lines of camels, fresh and laden, were being marshaled at other gates, heading for the roads to Persia, to Mesopotamia, to the Caucasus. Men haggled over sacks of almonds and pistachios. A group of Armenian merchants in distinctive woolen hats consulted a wax tablet. A train of ox carts piled high with crimson pomegranates creaked past. This was not an end. It was a great, slow-motion whirlpool where routes converged and diverged again. You did not join the flow. You simply sat, your body humming with a fatigue too deep for sleep. The notebook from Bukhara was a solid presence in your tunic. You did not take it out. As the last light faded, the stars emerged. They were the same stars that had guided the trip, the cold, brilliant constellations that had wheeled over the Taklamakan, the crowded river of the Milky Way that had arched over the Zarafshan Valley, the sharp, icy points that had watched from the Tian Shan passes. They were unchanged. You had traversed a continent beneath them, and they had not moved a fraction. The understanding was not one of insignificance, but of profound connection. You had been a moving point under their fixed gaze. The journey, the dust, the thirst, the cold, the awe, the fatigue, was now a complete thing, a closed circle. It settled into memory not as a series of events, but as a single, solidified experience, a new layer of your being. In the dark, from your perch on the wall, you watched the lanterns being lit in the caravanserai's archways, tiny, warm stars against the earth. The sounds of the road, the camels, the calls, the creak of leather continued, but they were no longer your sounds. Your part in that particular heartbeat was done. You felt the journey settle complete. The calm that filled you was absolute, the calm of a task fully endured, a path fully walked. You sat until the night grew cold, watching the eternal stars, feeling the memory of every step etched into your bones, quiet and whole. Dawn in Merv was a gentle, dusty gold, the light seeping into the vast caravanserai courtyard and illuminating the night's detritus, scattered straw, the dark stains of old spills, the sleeping forms of men who had arrived too late to find a room. You woke on your pallet in the arcade, the deep, structural fatigue of the journey still present in your limbs, but now overlaid with a new, strange lightness. The obligation to walk was gone. You rose and moved to the courtyard's edge, a cup of hot, bitter tea in your hands. From this vantage, you watched the caravan begin its final, quiet dissolution. The process was not chaotic, but a slow, purposeful unraveling. The camels, their humps diminished but their eyes calm, were being led away by their various owners or by new handlers. The great communal pile of baggage had vanished in the night, disassembled into its constituent parts. A Persian merchant you recognized supervised the loading of his rolled carpets onto a string of donkeys, bound for the road to Isfahan. The two Mongol teamsters were already gone, likely having sold their remaining pelts and departed with the dawn for the northern steppes. The Uyghur trader was deep in conversation with a man whose dress marked him as a wholesaler for the markets of Baghdad. Goods and people, held in temporary suspension for months, were now flowing into the city's arteries, connecting to routes that spiderwebbed towards Persia, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and beyond. Anwar stood near the central well, a ledger in his hands, speaking quietly with the caravanserai's master. His work as caravan master was functionally complete, the contracts fulfilled, the wages settled. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the courtyard, and it found you. For a moment his eyes held yours. He did not smile. He gave a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgment devoid of sentiment, yet dense with meaning. It said, "We did it. We endured the same dust, the same thirst, the same cold. We are here." It was the only farewell either of you needed or would offer. A moment later, he turned back to his ledger, his attention already on the logistics of his own next movement, perhaps the acquisition of goods for a return journey or a period of rest in the city. The bond of the road was absolute, but it was also transient. You understood now, standing there with the warm clay cup in your hands, the steam curling into the cool morning air. The Silk Road was not just a route on a map, a line connecting points of trade. It was a slow, collective heartbeat. It was the movement itself, the patient, relentless placing of one foot after another on gravel, on sand, on mountain scree, on packed earth. It was the shared rhythm of the march, the synchronized checking of water skins, the communal huddle against the wind on a high pass. It was the unspoken language of a nod across a landslide, the traded bowl of cheese on a mountainside, the silent companionship of a week walking through green fields under immense stars. It was a movement of people, yes, but more so of stories, not the grand tales of kings and conquests, but the small, gritty narratives of survival. The papermaker thinking of his vat in the desert, the herder's report on wolf packs, the remembered taste of a date on a stone plateau. It was the movement of weary feet under a vast, indifferent, and sometimes unbearably beautiful sky. You felt a part of it, not as a hero of the journey, but as a witness who had also endured. The anxiety of the novice was gone, burned away by sun and scoured by wind. In its place was a calm certainty. You were changed. The world felt simultaneously larger. You had crossed its very ribs, and smaller, for you now understood the deep, slow patterns that connected its far-flung oases and cities. You carried within you the silence of the Gobi, the cold clarity of the mountains, the scholarly hush of Bukhara's lanes, and the weary peace of the final plateau. Finishing your tea, you placed the empty cup on the wall. The courtyard was half empty now, the caravan's unique assembly scattered back into the world's great flow. You turned away from the well, from Anwar, from the arcade that had sheltered you. You had your own small business to attend to in Merv, your own connections to make. But as you walked towards the caravanserai's great gate, joining the human current moving into the city's awakening streets, you did so with a new rhythm in your step. It was the same slow, steady rhythm of the caravan, now internalized, a heartbeat you would carry with you, calm and changed, long after the dust of the road had settled from your clothes.